All right, let's jump into Article 2, aka the executive branch, aka the president. All right, so what's in Article 2? Well, one thing that I will say is that Article 2 is definitely more condensed than Article 1. It gives you information on the president, how he gets elected, list of his powers. Something that's unique about Article 2 is it's kind of vague. There's not much there, so a lot of it is touch and go, and the interpretation on what the president's role really is changes throughout history. But take note of his formal powers. He's the commander-in-chief. He makes treaties, makes pardons, appoint officials, but also take note of how most of his formal powers does also include another branch checking that power. For example, treaties have to be approved. Appointments must be approved. Vetoes can also be overridden by Congress. So that leads us into noticing that presidents today often rely on informal powers as opposed to formal powers, which I will discuss really soon. What's going on? All right, so speaking of those informal powers, you should be familiar with them, but I can go into detail. Those informal powers include executive agreements, executive orders, power of persuasion through the bully pulpit, executive privilege, and I would say a fairly new one would be signing statements. All right, so what is the definition of informal powers? Informal powers are not found in the Constitution. They're simply powers that previous presidents have exercised, and since then, presidents over time just continue to exercise them. So the truth is, until someone makes a fuss about it, until someone requests the United States Supreme Court to, evaluate these informal powers, presidents will continue to use them. Now, based on this list, there has been some scrutiny regards to presidents using the power of executive privilege, and we'll talk about that really soon. So one of the major powers of the president is that the president can veto a bill. If the president decides to veto a bill, that basically means he's sending it back to Congress. And he often tells Congress why he's decided to veto the bill. Now, we all know that it's very difficult to override a veto. So most of the time, when the president is aware of legislation that is coming to his desk, he would often express his concerns about it as a way of giving Congress an opportunity to create something that he would more than likely sign. Now, there are different types of veto. You have your normal, everyday veto, and then you have something called a pocket veto. A pocket veto is when the president doesn't sign the bill, nor does he veto the bill. What he basically does is allow the bill to commit suicide. He allows the bill to die because Congress made the mistake of sending that bill to him within a time frame of when Congress will eventually adjourn. He has 10 days to sign or veto the bill. I don't know if it's on the 10th day or after the 10th day, I don't think it really matters. But when that time frame is up, if Congress is not in session, if they're on vacation, the bill dies. But if they are in session, the bill automatically becomes a law because the president has chosen to not act on the bill. Okay. And sometimes, the president just allows a bill to become law without his signature because although he doesn't support it, he knows that there's a much larger group in favor of it. Let's talk about the president's role as commander-in-chief. So the president is the commander-in-chief. It is written in the Constitution. But within that same document, Congress has the power to declare war. And because of these two separate powers, it results in conflict between the two branches of government. And that conflict really reached an all-time high during the Vietnam War conflict, where public opinion had turned against the United States engaging in war in Vietnam, and Congress, being the body that it is, meaning that they are obligated or they feel the need to respond to public opinion, they decided to create a law called the War Powers Resolution of 1973. And the overall purpose of this law was to limit the president's power as commander-in-chief. So yeah, my video got cut off, but I just want to recap. So the purpose of the War Powers Resolution of 1973 was overall to limit the president's power as commander-in-chief by pretty much giving him some, directives, some rules. If the president wanted to commit U.S. forces to occupy or participate in any situation around the world, the president would now have to report his actions to Congress within 48 hours of withdrawing those troops. And when he withdraws those troops to that area of concern, he has 60 days. Once those 60 days are up, he needs to check back in with Congress. All right, Congress also decided that they have the power to remove those troops if necessary after 90 days, and they don't really need the president's permission to do that. But notice the language. The president must report, but it does not require Congress to approve. He just simply needs to report or give them a heads up or notify them. So, I mean, it's a way to kind of control the situation without completely discrediting him and his powers as commander-in-chief. The presidents always tell you that this law is like unconstitutional. And it's unconstitutional because it goes against their powers as commander-in-chief. Most presidents don't even follow it, and Congress don't do anything about it. So in my opinion, I just think that the law was created to appease those during the 1970s that were very vocal about the United States engaging in the Vietnam War. Okay? Let's keep it going. Let's talk about another informal power called executive privilege. Executive privilege is when the president decides that, certain pieces of information and, communication that he may engage in with his advisors or with other leaders around the world should be kept, confidential, or it's information or communication that does not have to be disclosed. Whenever he decides to not disclose information to the American people or to members of Congress, he or she is exercising executive privilege. Now, for many years, this was justified because our perspective on it is, well, the president reveals every single conversation, every single detail that him and his cabinet or advisors engage in, that could potentially put the country in danger. So some things are best left unsaid and kept in secrecy. But as you can see, during the 1970s, public opinion changed about presidents exercising executive privilege. In fact, with our former president, Richard Nixon, public opinion was really low. He was also engaged in a scandal called Watergate, which some of us are familiar with. And people in general were just really fed up with the president. exercising these powers that weren't even in the Constitution. So, of course, the United States filed a lawsuit against Nixon, and you don't really need to know details. It's really important to understand that this law, no, not this law, but this court case decided that executive privilege is, it is a power, but it's not a power that is absolute. It's not a power that should go unchecked. That makes sense? So we understand the need for that power, but we're not going to let you use it all the time. And in this case, Nixon was exercising that executive privilege for personal gain, to protect himself. This wasn't about the safety of the United States of America. This was about him saving his ass. But let's keep going. Let's talk about executive orders. So what is an executive order? Number one, it's an informal power. Number two, it's a directive issued by the president. It's usually given as an alternative to seeking legislation. In other words, an executive order feels like a law, because that's what a law does. It gives you direction. It gives you an order. You can or cannot do this or that. So why are presidents engaging in issuing executive orders? Because it undermines the entire legislative making process. Executive orders don't require congressional approval, and it's something that can be done quick and fast. Okay, because as you guys should know by now, the legislative making process can be slow. I think the founders wanted it to be slow, but when you're dealing with emergency situations like the coronavirus, you may want the president to work a little faster, and that the executive orders allow him to do that. All right. Just want to point out, executive orders is something that is used only in domestic policy, and also executive orders can expire when that president leaves office. So when former President Barack Obama left the White House, most, if not all, of his executive orders left with him. Okay? The only way to keep an executive order in effect is if the next incoming president decides to extend that executive order. And I'm pretty sure our current president didn't do that. All right? So executive orders replaces the need to seek legislation. What's great about it, it doesn't require congressional approval. But what's not great about what's not great about it, or I would say what the cons would be, that it doesn't really involve everyone. It's just one person issuing a directive, and it doesn't last a long time. It only lasts during that president's term in office. Executive agreements, very similar to executive orders, except that executive agreements replace treaties. If you take a look at my previous slide titled Article 2, presidents can create treaties, but they must be approved by the Senate, which explains why presidents have been leaning more towards executive agreements, because it has the same weight as a treaty in that it is an international agreement between the leader of our country and the leader of another country. But this agreement doesn't require Senate approval. Okay, and that's why presidents love executive agreements, because they don't have to seek the approval of Congress, specifically the Senate. Now, executive agreements are just like executive orders in that they don't last after the president leaves office. When he goes, the agreements have to go as well. Okay? What's that saying? You ain't gotta go home, but you gotta get out of here? That type of thing. Okay. Some other informal powers that could come up: signing statements. Signing statements is, I always say, it's like an FU statement. A signing statement is not a veto. It's not a line item veto. As you should know, line item vetoes are unconstitutional. It's when the president signs a bill but also includes a statement providing his interpretation of the bill, his interpretation on how he plans on enforcing that bill, which may not even align itself with what Congress wanted. So that's why I call it like you're throwing your middle finger up at the bill. You're telling them, yeah, I'll sign it. It's legislation, but I'm not going to enforce it the way you want me to do it. This is a real petty move. And we started to see this happen more often after 9/11 under former President Bush, when he was really focusing on expanding his power as president in order for him to fight against terrorism. Another common informal power is when the president uses the bully pulpit. He uses the fact that, hey, I'm one person, as opposed to Congress, which consists of 535 members. Who's the media going to focus on? Me. And because the media is going to always have the spotlight on me, that allows me to use that platform to sway public opinion. And if I am able, and I'm speaking as if I'm the president, if I'm able to sway public opinion, then Congress will have no choice but to follow, because Congress has to answer to the people every 2 years and every 6 years. All right. So there's a lot of persuading going on, bargaining. I mean, you name it, is there. How do we check the president? The president has formal powers, informal powers. He's also in a position to gain a lot of power during times of war, a crisis, an event like the coronavirus. You're noticing that our president is providing daily briefings. He's issuing executive orders. He is, he's the person that everyone's looking to for some type of solution. How do you control someone that is in a position to have so much power? You control them with the following. You control them with the power of impeachment. You control them with not confirming certain appointments. You control them by creating legislation like the War Powers Act. You control them with the dollars. Let me tell you something. Money is very powerful, okay, in life, period. So I believe that you can always get someone to conform when money is involved, and Congress is notorious for that. They can override his veto, but like I said, it's not a very successful method to check the president. And the Supreme Court can definitely check the president with judicial review, and we've seen that with the United States versus Nixon. We've seen it with a number of cases dealing with the president, but one that sticks out would be the U.S. versus Nixon in dealing with executive privilege. Now, the White House is where the president does his work. It's where the president sleeps, eats, shit, okay? But he does have an office called the White House office, okay? The West Wing. This is where you'll find most of the president's closest advisors. The people that work in the White House office don't have to be confirmed by the Senate. So what do you think he's going to do? He's going to make sure the people that he trusts the most work here, okay? You're going to see a lot of executive privilege going on here. There's a lot of secrets. There's a lot of, conversations that go unrecorded here. All right. And I get it. I'm not knocking it. I think presidents need, they need that. They need that because, government is dirty. You appoint someone today and they turn on you 2 weeks later. Okay. So yeah, that's the White House office. Let's talk about the federal bureaucracy. We talked about this in class, and I'm so glad we had an opportunity to do that. But let me just recap. The federal bureaucracy are all of those agencies, all of those departments that falls under the executive branch, and these individuals do the dirty work. They're doing the real work, guys. The president is not. He's enforcing the law, but he can't do that without the bureaucracy. We can't see the actual work without the workers. Okay? And a bureaucrat is someone that works for the federal government. They're there to get the job done. They're there to execute the policy. And we consider them to be the experts. They're not political officials. They're not voted into office. They're hired to do the job like everyday 9 to 5 working people. Okay. Some of them are appointed, but most, however, are hired as career level employees. So when you see a federal bureaucrat, when you see a civil servant of the federal government, you need to know that this individual is working for the federal government because they meet the qualifications, okay? They're hired based on merit, and that usually involves them passing some sort of exam or test, okay? Now, patronage doesn't really occur anymore in our federal government. And it was due to a legislation. I'm not going to sit here and make it seem like I remember the title of that legislation, but what I do know is that this law was created to eliminate the president from hiring individuals to work in the bureaucracy as a favor. Okay, we need people doing the real work, but we need to make sure that they are actually qualified to do the real work. Okay, they engage in what we call rulemaking, which I'll discuss really soon. The different categories under the federal bureaucracy involve cabinet departments, independent executive agencies, independent regulatory commissions, and government corporations. Pay attention to these next few slides because I wouldn't be surprised if College Board gives you a concept application writing prompt involving, these different departments or agencies. And I don't want you guys to get confused on the test because you simply didn't know this department or what this agency specialized in. Now, College Board does often provide you with some background info on that agency, but I think you'll have a better approach to the question if you go in having some knowledge for yourself. So the cabinet consists of 15 executive departments. They cover large, broad areas of policy, and they usually have a natural interest. There's something that they're there to do. For example, the Department of State, the Department of Defense, the Department of Homeland Security, which I believe is the latest one since 9/11. All cabinet secretaries are appointed by the president, approved by the Senate, but they can also be fired by the president as well. Independent executive agencies, they do resemble a cabinet department, but they have a more narrow area of responsibility and they perform services, okay, like the EPA is an agency that is there to protect the environment, okay? So very narrow. They perform services, they provide a service, they make sure that, the air that we breathe in is safe, okay? Now, independent regulatory commissions are agencies that were created by Congress to exist out of all of the major departments. And these commissions or these agencies are there to, in my opinion, get the job done without any political influence. Does that make sense? And you got to eliminate the political influence when you have departments regulating some type of economic activity. If you allow political influence to filter into these regulatory commissions, our economy will be regulated and operated in a way that benefits that organized group that may have influence over these departments or agencies. So how do we keep political influence out of the regulatory commissions? They are the heads of these regulatory commissions, they are appointed by the president, but they can't be fired. You got it? So once that individual is in, they're in, okay? And their terms stagger, okay? They could have 7-year terms, 14-year terms, and it's staggered in that way, so that way a president A president may have the power to appoint that individual, but that individual is going to be there longer than the president. Remember, presidential terms are 4 years. So you don't want the president that appointed that individual to now be faced with deciding if that person can stay in that position. Does that make sense? So you may get appointed by a president, and then when your time is up, a different president must determine if you should stay or go. Does that make sense? That also allows us to have a bureaucracy where I just got stuck, where you see a mixture of individuals. You don't want the president to be a Republican and everyone that's working in the bureaucracy to also be a Republican. Does that make sense? You want a little mixture. Pay attention. It's called Independent Regulatory Commission. So when I see the word independent, it tells me, oh, these are the departments, these are the agencies that are there to regulate something that requires them to not be politically biased. They're independent. The president does appoint, but he cannot what? Remove. We don't want any political influence in these commissions, which is why we call them independent regulatory commissions. Government corporations, businesses established by Congress to perform functions that at the time private businesses couldn't provide. One in particular we're all familiar with is the United States Postal Service. Okay, it was provided at a time when you didn't have UPS, you didn't have FedEx, you didn't have Amazon. Make sense? Now, there's always debate about, should we continue to have the U.S. Postal Service? Is it necessary? Okay, because when you look at the definition of a government corporation, it's there to provide something that private businesses weren't able to provide. But when you look at society today, it looks like they got it. So, I don't know. Let's take a look at a very important concept called the iron triangle. Now, I just walked you through these different federal bureaucracy cabinets and departments, right? Right? One in particular that comes into play when we look at the iron triangle would be the Independent Regulatory Commission. These are the agencies that make the rules for industry. These are the agencies that determine what's organic and what's not organic. And although it may seem very petty to you or very small, because the bureaucracy is the department that's doing the real work, how they create the rules will have a major impact on you as an individual, but also the industry. And depending on how they create those rules, that can result in these industries making more money or less. So these industries want to be involved in the rulemaking. And they do that in this visual called the iron triangle. So the iron triangle represents this relationship between members of Congress, members of an interest group that is representing that industry, and your bureaucrat, that federal government employee that has now been given the job of creating rules or regulations for a particular industry. This relationship is established because everyone in this triangle has something to gain. Interest groups, depending on how the rules are made, that could result in them helping the industry that they represent make $2-3 billion more that year. That member of Congress, if they're able to work with these individuals, that could result in them receiving campaign funding from these companies. And then the bureaucrat, you're probably saying, well, how could the bureaucrat benefit? They're not an elected official. They work for the government. What's in it for them? What's in it for them is that Congress will continue to approve funding for that agency. By approving funding for that agency, that keeps that bureaucrat employed. That's what I meant to say, employed. If Congress gets upset with how a particular agency is writing the rules, Congress may decide to cut the funding in half by 50%, and that may jeopardize that bureaucrat's job. He or she may get laid off. So, just to kind of speed up the time because we're at 30 minutes, take a moment to look at this diagram or whatever you want to call it, and just focus on what each individual could gain by creating these regulations together. You got it? Not in isolation, together. But how do we check the bureaucracy? How do we keep the bureaucracy in line? Because I know initially you were probably thinking, well, these people are just here to work. They have nothing to gain. They do have something to gain, which is why we have to kind of keep them in check. And also, because the bureaucracy doesn't have to respond to public opinion, but Congress does, and if anything goes wrong, no one's thinking of the bureaucrat. They're thinking of the president. They're thinking of Congress. So despite them being the entity that does the real work, when it's time to blame someone in these situations, they often go unblamed. Is that even a word? They often dodge a bullet. That's what I really meant to say. They often dodge a bullet, and Congress and the president tends to feel the brunt of the public, getting upset about something. So as a member of Congress and as the president of the United States, how do you keep these agencies in line so that way you won't have to take a bullet or take the blame for something that they did? Okay? Checks on the bureaucracy. The president can appoint and remove agency heads. They can issue executive orders. They can, that's all the president can really do. Okay? All right. What can Congress do? They can investigate. That's congressional oversight. We talked about that. They can change the budget, limit the use of funds, reduce the amount that's given to that agency, which results in them having 20 employees to now only needing 5. Okay? The Supreme Court could also rule on whether or not the bureaucracy has acted within the realms of the law, So the check and balance system applies to the bureaucracy as well. And the bureaucrats, they understand that this can happen. So although they are the experts, although they do have the power to make rules without having to answer to the American people, because they have to answer to Congress, the president, and the Supreme Court, that kind of keeps them in check as well. So that's it for today. I decided I want to kind of break up my videos by branch because, as you can see, each branch can take about 30 minutes. So I'm going to pause on this one and create a new one for you.